In 2006, Daniel Craig became the new James Bond, and since then has starred in 4 of the 007 productions, with the 5th one coming out this year. I'm a moderate fan of the franchise. I have taken the time to watch every individual entry, but most of them range from typical action movie to straight up outdated. I do like some of them. I do consider some of them to be great. I think Goldfinger is amazing. For Your Eyes Only is the best of the Roger Moore films. And I like the Craig films, Skyfall and Casino Royale. So with the latest entry, Spectre, where does this fall in the 60-year history of James Bond in movies?
Directed by Sam Mendes, returning to the director's chair after the huge success of Skyfall, Spectre attempts to once again take the character in a more personal, intimate direction. Instead of James Bond being a placeholder for an action hero with all the established tropes, they try to instead dig into his history and mostly leave the gadgets at home. Skyfall is my favorite Bond movie, plain and simple. It really dug into the character and had a captivating story and good villain, and it felt like a culmination of everything 007, seeing that it was released on the 50th anniversary of Dr. No. It was highly praised and made over $1 billion worldwide, so Spectre had quite an act to follow. With the returning cast and crew, it's easy to indulge in the comparisons between the two. Skyfall is the better movie, so let's move the conversation onward. Spectre attempts to continue the storyline, and even has connections to Quantum of Solace, which went entirely ignored in the previous film. With the introduction of Christoph Waltz's Oberhauser, this brings everything previously learned in the Craig storyline and builds it up to a bit of an anticlimactic finale. If you know anything about James Bond, you know that the movies hardly follow any kind of continuity, but since 2006, they have tried to give the character an arc. With Spectre, they try to reveal more of Bond's past, while also bringing in more humorous moments and a couple more gadgets. Spectre is a sequel to Skyfall, but also reintroduces the tropes we've come to love or hate. Spectre has a lot to live up to, and at times it feels like it's being built as the final episode in the Craig storyline, but it doesn't really pack in the action nearly as much as you'd expect. The opening scene is fantastic, basically a trial run for Mendes to do an extended tracking shot, which would be perfected in his film 1917. This begins a simple enough story. Ever since Skyfall, James has wanted to learn the identity of a boy in a destroyed photo, while also executing one final assignment from the deceased M, played by Judi Dench. The typical locations are here with the snowy terrains, the lavish set designs, and the sleek costumes. But what does it all boil down to? Well, Oberhauser is basically what Palpatine was in Rise of Skywalker. He's the author and creator of Bond's pain, and his organization, Spectre, famous in the Bond legacy, has been personally responsible for the deaths of major characters since Casino Royale, and has a connection to the other Nemesises, is that right? Nemesi? The other bad guys. I'm not really a fan of this kind of twist because, to me, it lessens the blow of the previous entries. Mads Mikkelsen is amazing in Casino Royale, but now, going back to that movie, it makes it slightly less invigorating when you have Christoph Waltz as a puppet master in the back of your mind. It doesn't affect the other movies too much because it doesn't divulge into a bigger scheme or a different set of goals. Everything is still the same, but now those other characters are connected to a bigger organization, one that was already well known in the 007 franchise. But I still wish the Oberhauser villain, who was revealed to be another character entirely, would have been kept separate from everything else, because there's all this build-up as if it's going to culminate into something revolutionary for the series, or something mind-opening, but it instead leads to a bit of a silly twist, one that I haven't gotten a grasp on even after multiple viewings. The moment of doom for our hero is a torture scene, which is so unintentionally lame. I question why they didn't take more notes from the Connery era here. I enjoyed the wit of this entry and bringing back the sillier weapons, but this torture scene seems like someone saw the famous laser scene in Goldfinger and wanted to make it more realistic. But this is 007. It's always been on the edge of the implausible, so compared to the Goldfinger torture scene, something that's visually pleasing, Spectre creates something that's pointlessly complex and unsatisfactory. The heroes even escape in a way that, for this villain, seems incredibly dumb. It all leads to a battle at the remains of the secret intelligence building, which also has a simple escape scene, and a showdown that feels so unexciting that I feel flabbergasted by how underutilized Christoph Waltz's performance is. You have one of the best actors of the modern age as a James Bond villain, and it leads to a couple minutes of screen time. Sure, he returns in the next entry, but we didn't know that at the time, and even then, based on the trailers, it feels like he's barely going to be in the new movie as well. It's not just disappointing as a follow-up to Skyfall, or as a continuation of the Craig storyline, or as a James Bond film itself, but it's disappointing as an action movie. The series was re-examining itself since 2006, understanding that there's now competition in this bloated field, with the likes of Mission Impossible, Jason Bourne, and now the John Wick movies. Spectre feels like a failed attempt to be like those other movies, rather than stay defined in the James Bond mold. It wants to bring back the success of Skyfall, but without as interesting of a story. In fact, instead of continuing some kind of arc, maybe it was just time to have James Bond go on another adventure. Because how much more can we discover in his past? We got what we needed from the other films, and with so many other elements wanting to return to the glory days of the franchise, why can't the story as well? I like Dave Bautista, even though he hardly gets a line. Léa Seydoux stands out from the other Bond girls. Moneypenny made a splash in Skyfall, so I wonder why they cut her role down substantially here. In fact, all the other characters I could have used more of. Craig is still shining, even after a decade as James Bond, and Christoph Waltz, while severely underused, has a stunning performance as always. This is a movie about watching good acting and stellar cinematography. It doesn't really make me mad like the other fans, even though I agree with most of the gripes. I still have a good time watching it, but it just feels like one of the lesser Bond movies. The only difference is, the worst James Bond movies typically have a bunch of memorable moments, but Spectre lacks any kind of presence. It doesn't make a big enough excuse to exist, but if I were to go back and give the Craig saga a rewatch, it would feel blasphemous to leave this one out. I wouldn't call it a failure, it's just not as good as Casino Royale or Skyfall. At least we can all agree that it's better than Quantum of Solace. Thanks to Lucas for this Patreon request, and thanks to all my Patreon supporters. For only $7, you can get your own monthly movie review. Ask me to review anything I haven't already. There's also other perks like blogs, exclusive videos, and early access. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and thanks so much for watching this video.